The bitter wind howled through the mountain pass, carrying snow that bit like tiny glass shards against exposed skin. Jedediah Morgan pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his weathered frame, his eyes narrowing against the onslaught of the sudden blizzard. At 53, he'd weathered more Rocky Mountain winters than most men twice his age, but this storm had caught even him by surprise. His mustache and beard were already crusted with ice as he urged his chestnut mare forward through the deepening drifts. Behind him, the supply wagon creaked and groaned, the two draft horses struggling against both the incline and the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The mining settlement of Silver Creek was still a good 15 miles away, and Jedediah knew with grim certainty they wouldn't make it before nightfall. I'd like to ask all of you watching to please subscribe to the channel. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? "We need to find shelter," Jedediah called out over his shoulder, his voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. In the wagon sat Catherine Winters, a young widow of 28, who had hired Jedediah to escort her to Silver Creek, where her brother had struck a promising vein in his claim. She had been full of hope when they'd left Denver 3 days ago, her green eyes bright with the promise of a new beginning after 2 years of struggling alone. Now, those same eyes were wide with fear as she clutched the wagon's wooden seat, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. "There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile east," Jedediah shouted again, gesturing toward a ridge of pines barely visible through the swirling white. "If it's still standing, we can wait out the worst of it." Catherine nodded, pulling her woolen scarf higher over her nose and mouth. Her cheeks were already reddened by the cold, and Jedediah knew that despite her brave face, she wasn't accustomed to such harsh conditions. He'd been reluctant to take a woman on this journey so late in the season, but her determination and the generous payment she'd offered had persuaded him. Now, he silently cursed himself for that decision, as the wind picked up, driving the temperature even lower. Jedediah led them off the main trail, breaking fresh path through thickening snow. The horses labored with each step, steam billowing from their nostrils. Catherine remained silent, but Jedediah could sense her growing anxiety. She was city-bred, the daughter of a successful merchant from Boston who had married a Denver businessman. When her husband died unexpectedly of pneumonia, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay, her only remaining family had been her younger brother Michael, who had gone west to seek his fortune in the Colorado silver mines. Jedediah admired her courage. Many women would have sold everything and returned east, but Catherine had chosen to forge ahead, to rebuild her life in this untamed territory. The cabin appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, a small, squat structure of rough-hewn logs, nearly buried on its northern side by a snowdrift. Relief washed over Jedediah's face as he slid from his horse, the snow reaching midway up his calves as he trudged toward the door. "Thank the Lord," he muttered under his breath, brushing away snow from the latch. The door swung open with a protesting creak, revealing a single room with a stone fireplace along one wall. It was cold and musty, but blessedly dry, and would offer protection from the elements. Jedediah turned back toward the wagon, waving Catherine inside while he saw to the horses. "I'll get a fire started once the animals are tended to," he called out, already unhitching the team. Catherine nodded, gathering her satchel and a small bundle of provisions before making her way carefully toward the cabin. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, and Jedediah watched her struggle against it, ready to assist if needed. But she persevered, disappearing inside the shelter as he led the horses around to the lean-to attached to the cabin side. It was crude, but would keep them out of the direct wind. He quickly removed their tack, brushing snow from their backs and covering them with blankets from the wagon. They would need the animals healthy, if they were to continue their journey once the storm passed. By the time Jedediah entered the cabin, arms laden with firewood he'd found stacked beneath the lean-to, Catherine had already begun clearing debris from the fireplace. Dust and cobwebs had accumulated, suggesting it had been at least a season since anyone had used the place. "Whoever last stayed here left it clean enough," she remarked, arranging kindling in the fireplace. Her voice was steady despite the cold that made her words visible in the air. "There's even some dried beans and salt pork in that cupboard." She nodded toward a small set of shelves built into one wall. Jedediah grunted in acknowledgement, setting down the wood and kneeling to help with the fire. "Trappers have a code," he explained, striking his flint. "Leave a place better than you found it, with something for the next poor soul who might need shelter." The spark caught the dry kindling, and Jedediah gently blew on it, coaxing the flame to life. "That's the way of things out here. Never know when you might be that next soul." The fire grew slowly, casting a warm orange glow over the cabin's interior. As heat began to radiate, Jedediah stood, removing his coat and hat, shaking off the snow before hanging them on pegs by the door. Catherine remained by the fire, her hands outstretched toward its warmth, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. Jedediah busied himself retrieving supplies from the wagon, making multiple trips through the intensifying storm. By the time he finished, nearly an inch of fresh snow covered his shoulders, and the light was fading fast. The blizzard showed no signs of abating, with the wind actually picking up force, howling around the cabin's corners like a living thing. Inside, Catherine had found an old iron pot and was preparing a simple stew with their provisions and those left by previous occupants. The domesticity of the scene struck Jedediah as he stamped snow from his boots. It had been many years since he'd shared such a moment with a woman. Since Emily had died in childbirth 12 years ago, taking their unborn son with her, he had lived a solitary existence, taking jobs guiding travelers and supply wagons through the mountains. "Should be enough food for a couple of days," Catherine said, looking up as he closed the door against the storm. "Do you think we'll be here that long?" There was concern in her voice, but no panic. Jedediah appreciated her composure. Too many city folk fell apart when faced with the realities of frontier life. "Hard to say," he answered truthfully, moving to check the cabin's small window. The glass was frosted over, but through a small clear patch, he could see only swirling white. These early winter storms can blow themselves out by morning, or they can last for days. "We're safe here, though. That's what matters." Catherine nodded, stirring the pot thoughtfully. "My brother will worry if I don't arrive when expected." "Michael Winters is a sensible man," Jedediah replied, recalling the few times he'd encountered Catherine's brother in Silver Creek. "He knows the mountains. He'll understand." He didn't add that travel in these conditions would be not just difficult, but potentially fatal. Catherine was intelligent enough to grasp that without him spelling it out. Instead, he focused on practical matters. "The fire should last the night with what wood we've got. Tomorrow I'll see about finding more if we need it." He moved to help her with the meal, the two of them working in comfortable silence as the storm raged outside. Somehow, in this tiny cabin far from civilization, they had created a pocket of warmth and safety in defiance of the wilderness that surrounded them. The next morning dawned gray and forbidding, with no break in the snowfall. If anything, the drifts had grown higher overnight, now reaching the window ledge. Jedediah woke first, adding wood to the fire before Catherine stirred from her makeshift bed near the hearth. He had insisted on sleeping on the floor near the door, giving her what privacy he could in the confined space. Now, as she sat up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, her hair loose around her face, Jedediah felt a strange tightness in his chest. She looked younger somehow, vulnerable yet strong, reminding him of Emily in a way that was both painful and comforting. "Still snowing," he said gruffly, moving to put on his coat. "I need to check the horses." The temperature had dropped further overnight, and the wind cut through Jedediah's layers as if they were nothing more than paper. The lean-to had protected the horses from the worst of it, but they were restless, sensing his concern. He fed them oats from their supply, speaking in low, reassuring tones. "Just a bit longer, girl," he murmured to his mare, stroking her neck. "We'll get through this." The draft horses nickered softly in response, their breath visible in the frigid air. Jedediah surveyed what he could see of their surroundings, which wasn't much beyond 20 feet in any direction. The trail they had followed was completely obscured, and the pines that had been visible upon their arrival were now just dark shadows in a world of white. When he returned to the cabin, Catherine had prepared coffee using melted snow water. The rich aroma filled the small space, momentarily overshadowing the scent of damp wool and wood smoke. "It doesn't look good, does it?" she asked, handing him a steaming cup. Her perception surprised him. Most passengers he escorted preferred comforting lies to harsh truths. "No, ma'am, it doesn't," he admitted, warming his hands around the tin cup. "We're looking at another day here at least, maybe more." Catherine sighed, but nodded in acceptance. "We should inventory our supplies," she suggested pragmatically. "And perhaps you could show me how to set snares." "If we're to be here for days, fresh meat would be welcome." Her practical approach impressed Jedediah. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Mrs. Winters," he said with approval. She smiled slightly at that, a hint of color touching her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. "Please call me Catherine," she replied. "If we're to be snowbound together, formality seems rather pointless." Jedediah nodded, somewhat awkwardly. It had been a long time since he'd been on a first-name basis with a respectable woman. "Jedediah, then," he conceded, "though most folks just call me Jed." They spent the morning taking stock of their situation, rationing provisions, and melting snow for water. By midday, the wind had died down somewhat, though the snow continued to fall steadily. Jedediah seized the opportunity to gather more firewood, and true to her word, Catherine insisted on learning to set simple wire snares. She listened attentively as he explained the technique, her gloved hands mimicking his movements, until she could do it herself. They set half a dozen snares in a semicircle around the cabin's clearing, where rabbits might venture in search of bark or whatever vegetation they could find beneath the snow. As they worked, Catherine told him about her life in Boston, her marriage to Thomas Winters, and her hopes for a fresh start in Silver Creek. "Thomas was kind," she said softly as they trudged back toward the cabin. "But he wasn't suited for frontier life. The Denver winters alone were enough to weaken his constitution." Jedediah observed, heading even deeper into the wilderness. Catherine paused, looking out at the endless white landscape. "Here I am," she agreed. "Perhaps I'm running toward something rather than away." Her words stayed with Jedediah as they settled back inside the cabin. He found himself studying her as she moved about the small space, noting the determination in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her manner too forthright. But there was an undeniable appeal to her that went beyond the physical. She caught him watching and raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Just thinking you might do all right in Silver Creek," he said gruffly, turning away to tend the fire. The storm continued for 3 more days, occasionally abating enough to allow them short excursions outside to check the horses, gather more wood, and inspect the snares, which yielded 2 rabbits over that time. They established a routine of sorts, sharing tasks and stories as they waited for the weather to clear. Catherine proved to be not just resilient, but resourceful, finding ways to improve their situation with limited means. She fashioned a crude broom from pine branches to keep the cabin floor clear of debris, and used snow to scrub their cooking pot clean. In turn, Jedediah taught her wilderness skills, how to judge wind direction, how to keep extremities from freezing, how to conserve energy when moving through deep snow. On the evening of the 4th day, Catherine developed a cough. At first, she dismissed it as nothing, a mere irritation from the smoky fire. But by morning, it had deepened, and Jedediah noticed a flush to her cheeks that concerned him. "Just a chill," she insisted when he asked after her health. "I'm not accustomed to these temperatures, that's all." She continued with her tasks, though Jedediah observed she tired more easily, often pausing to rest or catch her breath. By nightfall, there was no denying she had fallen ill. Her breathing had become labored, and when Jedediah placed a hand on her forehead, he found it burning with fever. "You're sick," he said bluntly, concern hardening his voice, "and getting sicker." Catherine tried to protest, but a fit of coughing overtook her, leaving her gasping for air. Jedediah helped her to lie down, adding extra blankets and moving her bedding closer to the fire. "I have some willow bark in my supplies," he told her, already rummaging through his saddlebags. "It'll help with the fever." He steeped the bark in hot water, creating a bitter tea that Catherine struggled to swallow. Throughout the night, her condition worsened. Jedediah remained awake, applying cold compresses to her forehead and helping her drink water whenever she was conscious enough to do so. By dawn, her breathing had become shallow and rapid, her skin alternating between burning hot and clammy cold. Outside, the storm had finally broken. The sky cleared to a brilliant blue, the sun reflecting blindingly off the pristine snow. Under different circumstances, Jedediah would have been eager to get moving, to make up for lost time while the weather held. Now, he stood at the cabin's threshold, torn between conflicting imperatives. Catherine needed medicine, real medicine, not just his rudimentary remedies. The nearest doctor was in Silver Creek, but the journey would be arduous at best, impossible at worst, with the deep snow covering the trail. And moving Catherine in her condition might kill her faster than the illness. Yet doing nothing wasn't an option either. He returned to her side, kneeling to check her pulse. It fluttered weakly beneath his fingers, too fast and irregular. "Catherine," he said gently, rousing her from a fitful sleep. Her eyes opened, glazed with fever, but still alert enough to focus on his face. "I need to get you to Silver Creek, to a doctor." She nodded weakly, then grimaced as another coughing spell seized her. When it subsided, she clutched at his arm with surprising strength. "I can ride," she whispered hoarsely. "Just help me onto a horse." Jedediah shook his head firmly. "You're too weak to sit a saddle," he countered. "And the wagon would never make it through these drifts." He hesitated, then added, "I could go ahead, bring back help." The fear that flashed across her face at this suggestion told him everything. "Don't leave me to die in the snow," she begged, her voice breaking. "I don't want to die alone, Jed." The desperation in her eyes struck him like a physical blow. He had seen that same fear in Emily's eyes when the midwife had told him there were complications, that he needed to choose between his wife and his unborn child. He had lost them both anyway. The memory hardened his resolve. "I'll carry you until my last breath," he promised, clasping her hand in his. "But you're not going to die, Catherine. Not if I have anything to say about it." The relief on her face was immediate. The whether from his promise not to leave or his determination that she would live, he couldn't tell. Jedediah spent the next hour preparing. He fashioned a travois from pine poles and blankets, a simply sled that could be pulled behind his mare. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would allow them to transport Catherine while keeping her as warm and stable as possible. He packed their remaining supplies, prioritizing water and the warmest blankets and furs they had. The draft horses would have to be left behind. They couldn't navigate the deep snow with the same agility as his mare. Jedediah left them with enough feed for several days and the lean-to for shelter. Some other traveler would find them eventually, or they would find their own way back to civilization when the snow began to melt. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Jedediah bundled Catherine in every available layer, wrapping her so thoroughly that only her face remained visible. She was too weak to stand on her own, and he lifted her as gently as possible, cradling her against his chest as he carried her to the travois. "It's going to be rough going," he warned as he settled her onto the makeshift sled. "Try to sleep if you can. Save your strength." Catherine nodded, her eyes already drifting closed as fever and exhaustion claimed her again. Jedediah secured her with ropes to prevent her from slipping off, then attached the travois to his mare's saddle. With one final look at the cabin that had sheltered them, he urged his horse forward, beginning the arduous journey toward Silver Creek. The going was indeed difficult. The snow reached past the horse's knees in places, and Jedediah often had to dismount and break trail himself, leading his mare by the reins. The travois slid reasonably well over the snow's surface, but every bump and dip jolted its passenger. Catherine drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out in delirium, other times lying so still that Jedediah stopped to check that she was still breathing. The sun beat down with deceptive brightness, offering light but little warmth. By midday, they had covered perhaps 3 miles, a painfully slow pace given the 15 they needed to travel. Jedediah's muscles burned with effort, and his mare was already showing signs of fatigue. "We'll rest here," he decided, finding a small clearing sheltered by a stand of pines. He unhitched the travois and built a small fire, melting snow for water. Catherine stirred as he lifted her closer to the warmth, her eyes fluttering open. "Where?" she murmured, confused. "On the way to Silver Creek," Jedediah reminded her gently. "How are you feeling?" She considered this for a moment, then answered with unexpected honesty. Like death warmed over, a ghost of her usual spirit flickered in her eyes. But not quite ready to die yet. Jedediah managed a smile at that, helping her sip water mixed with the last of their sugar for energy. "Good," he said gruffly, "because I'm not ready to let you." They rested for an hour, no longer. Jedediah knew that stopping too long in these conditions could be as dangerous as pushing too hard. When they resumed their journey, he noticed the sky beginning to change. New clouds were building on the western horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of more snow. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. They might have one day of clear weather, not the 2 or 3 he had hoped for. The race against time became more urgent, and he pushed forward with renewed determination, ignoring the protests of his aging body. Catherine had fallen silent again, her breathing increasingly labored. Each rasping inhale spurred Jedediah to greater effort. By late afternoon, they had covered another 4 miles, bringing their total to perhaps 7, not even halfway to Silver Creek. The new storm was advancing quickly, already obscuring the mountains to the west. Jedediah knew they couldn't be caught in the open when it hit. He scanned their surroundings desperately for any sign of shelter. There was nothing but endless snow and scattered pines, no cabins or caves or rock formations that might offer protection. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Had he made a terrible mistake? Should they have remained at the cabin, taking their chances with Catherine's illness rather than exposing her to these harsh elements in her weakened state? As if sensing his fears, Catherine stirred on the travois. "Jed," she called, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to pick up. He was at her side instantly, kneeling in the snow. "Save your strength," he urged, but she shook her head weakly. "If I don't make it," she began, only to be cut off by his vehement denial. "You will," he insisted. "We both will." Catherine managed a faint smile, reaching out to touch his weathered face with fingers that felt like ice, despite their coverings. "You're a good man, Jedediah Morgan. I'm glad it was you I hired." Before he could respond, she slipped back into unconsciousness, her hand falling limply onto the blankets. Jedediah stared at her pale face, emotion welling up in his chest. In less than a week, this woman had awakened feelings he thought long dead. Not just attraction, though there was that too, but admiration, respect, and a fierce protectiveness he hadn't experienced since losing Emily. He couldn't fail her now. With renewed determination, he remounted his mare and continued forward, squinting against the wind that now carried the first new snowflakes. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening approached, and Jedediah knew they had perhaps an hour of daylight left, if that. He pushed his mare as hard as he dared, the animal responding valiantly despite her exhaustion. Just as the light began to fade in earnest, Jedediah spotted something through the increasing snowfall, a dark shape that stood out against the white landscape. He altered course slightly, making for what he now recognized as a small line shack, the kind used by ranch hands when working far from the main property during cattle drives or boundary riding. It was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it would provide shelter from the coming storm. Hope surged through him as he urged his tired mare forward. "Just a little further, girl," he encouraged. "You can rest soon." The horse seemed to understand, summoning new energy for the final stretch. The shack was rudimentary but sound, with a small stove rather than an open fireplace, a luxury Jedediah hadn't expected. There was even a narrow bunk built against one wall, though the thin mattress had long since been claimed by mice. Still, it was better than the floor. He carried Catherine inside first, settling her on the bunk before returning for their supplies and to see to his horse. The mare would have to make do with the minimal shelter offered by the shack's small overhang, but Jedediah covered her with his own blanket after removing her tack, promising silently to make it up to the loyal animal once they reached civilization. Inside, he quickly started a fire in the stove, grateful for the dry firewood stacked in one corner. As warmth began to fill the tiny space, Jedediah turned his attention back to Catherine. Her condition had deteriorated further during their journey. Her breathing was now accompanied by a worrying rattle, and her pulse was rapid and thready beneath his fingertips. The fever burned hotter than ever, yet her extremities were cold to the touch, a dangerous sign. Jedediah had seen pneumonia before. Without proper medicine, it could kill even the strongest man, let alone a woman already weakened by days of illness. He knew what he had to do, though it terrified him. "Catherine," he said firmly, rousing her from her fevered sleep, "I need to help you breathe easier. It's going to be uncomfortable, She nodded slightly, too weak to speak. With gentle but efficient movements, Jedediah propped her up with their remaining blankets, elevating her upper body to ease her labored breathing. Then, he opened her coat and the top buttons of her dress, placing a cold compress on her chest. "Old trapper's remedy," he explained as she flinched from the cold. "Helps draw out the fever." Next came the hardest part. He produced a small flask from his coat pocket, not alcohol, but a potent mixture of herbs and roots he'd learned to prepare from a Ute medicine man many years ago. "This tastes foul," he warned, supporting her head as he held the flask to her lips. "But it might help clear your lungs." Catherine grimaced at the bitter taste, but swallowed obediently, trusting him completely. The mixture would either help or do nothing. It wouldn't harm her, at least. That was the extent of Jedediah's medical knowledge. Everything else was in God's hands now. Outside, the new storm had arrived in full force. Snow driving horizontally past the shack's single small window. They were trapped again, but at least they were 7 miles closer to Silver Creek, in a shelter with a proper stove. It wasn't much, but it was something. Throughout the night, Jedediah maintained his vigil. He kept the stove burning hot, changed Catherine's compresses regularly, and helped her sip water whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. He spoke to her constantly, whether she could hear him or not, telling stories of his life before she knew him, his childhood in Kentucky, his journey west as a young man full of dreams, his years as a buffalo hunter, then a scout for the Army, then a guide for settlers and prospectors. He told her about Emily, something he had never shared with another living soul. And he promised, over and over, that he wouldn't leave her, that they would make it to Silver Creek together. Sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, Catherine's fever broke. Jedediah noticed the change immediately. Her skin cooling, the flush receding from her cheeks, her breathing becoming less labored. He sat beside her, scarcely daring to hope as he watched the steady rise and fall of her chest. The rattling sound had diminished, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. When she opened her eyes, they were clear for the first time in days, focusing on his face with recognition rather than fevered confusion. "You look terrible," she whispered hoarsely, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Relief washed over Jedediah so powerfully that he had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. "And you look better," he replied, when he trusted his voice again. "How do you feel?" Catherine considered this, taking stock of her condition. "Weak as a newborn kitten," she admitted, "but I can breathe again." She reached for his hand, her fingers still cool but no longer ice-cold. "Thank you, Jed, for not leaving me." The simple sincerity in her voice threatened to undo him completely. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to find adequate words. Instead, he busied himself preparing a thin broth from their supplies, knowing she needed nourishment to recover her strength. Outside, the storm continued unabated, but its fury seemed less threatening now that Catherine's immediate crisis had passed. Morning brought no break in the weather, but Catherine continued to improve. She was able to sit up with support, to take small sips of broth, and even to speak for short periods before tiring. The rattle in her chest persisted, but it was less pronounced, and her cough, while still present, no longer seized her with the same devastating force. Jedediah allowed himself cautious optimism. "We'll wait out this storm," he decided, checking their supplies. They had enough to last another 2 days, if they were careful. "Once it passes, if you're strong enough, we'll continue to Silver Creek." Catherine nodded in agreement, then surprised him by adding, And if I'm not strong enough, you'll go on without me. Jedediah started to protest, but she raised a hand to stop him. Listen to me, Jed. I'm better, yes, but far from well. If this turns again— She paused, gathering strength. I won't have you die trying to save me. If it comes to that, you go for help, and come back if you can. Her voice was weak, but determined. Jedediah recognized the same steel that had first impressed him when she'd insisted on making the journey to Silver Creek, despite his warnings about the season. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, he said gruffly, unwilling to agree to her terms but recognizing the practicality behind them. Catherine seemed satisfied with this non-committal response, settling back against her makeshift pillows with a tired sigh. The storm lasted another full day before beginning to abate. During that time, Catherine's condition stabilized. She remained weak, but the fever didn't return, and her breathing continued to improve incrementally. Jedediah used the enforced delay to rest his own tired body and to plan their next move. The snow would be even deeper now, making travel that much more difficult. But they were closer to Silver Creek than to their original starting point, and continuing forward seemed their best option. His mare had recovered somewhat from the previous day's exertion, though she would still be operating well below her usual strength. Everything hinged on Catherine's ability to withstand another day of travel. On the morning of the third day, the storm finally broke. Sunlight streamed through the shack's window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Jedediah stepped outside to assess conditions. The snow was indeed deep, nearly 3 feet in places, but the sky was clear, promising at least temporary good weather. He returned inside to find Catherine already attempting to dress herself, moving with painful slowness but with clear determination. "I'm ready," she stated, though the effort of speaking left her breathless. Jedediah raised an eyebrow skeptically, but didn't argue. They both knew their options were limited. Stay and risk running out of supplies, or go and risk the journey's hardships. "We'll take it slow," Jedediah said as he helped her into her coat, noticing how it now hung loosely on her frame after days of illness and minimal nourishment. "Stop whenever you need to rest." Catherine nodded, leaning heavily against him as he guided her outside to the waiting travois. The brightness of the snow momentarily blinded her, and she blinked rapidly, raising a hand to shield her eyes. Jedediah settled her as comfortably as possible on the travois, making sure she was secure before mounting his mare. The horse snorted, her breath visible in the cold air, but moved forward willingly when he nudged her sides. They set off once more towards Silver Creek, leaving the small line shack that had been their sanctuary. The going was slow but steady. The worst of the drifts had been packed somewhat by the wind, creating a crust that, while still challenging, was marginally easier to navigate than the fresh powder had been. Jedediah set a deliberate pace, mindful of both his horse's stamina and Catherine's fragile condition. They stopped frequently, more frequently than he would have liked, but necessary to ensure neither woman nor beast was pushed beyond endurance. During these breaks, he checked on Catherine, helping her sip water and adjusting her blankets. She remained alert and determined, though he could see the journey taking its toll in the lines of pain that etched themselves deeper around her eyes and mouth. By midday, they had covered perhaps 4 miles. According to Jedediah's reckoning, they were now approximately 11 miles from the cabin where their ordeal had begun, and 4 miles from Silver Creek. Under normal conditions, they could have covered the remaining distance in a couple of hours. As it was, they might reach town by nightfall if they pushed on without further delays. The thought spurred Jedediah forward, his focus narrowing to the task at hand, 1 foot in front of the other, 1 mile at a time. He had long since passed the point of acknowledging his own exhaustion. There would be time for that later, once Catherine was safe in Silver Creek, under a doctor's care. The landscape began to change subtly as they continued, the terrain becoming more familiar to Jedediah as they approached areas he had traversed many times before. They passed landmarks he recognized, even beneath their winter coverings. A distinctive rock formation, a stand of aspens whose silver-white trunks stood out against the darker pines. A bend in the trail that followed the curve of a now-frozen creek. These familiar sights renewed his energy, confirming they were on the right path and drawing ever closer to their destination. Catherine noticed the change in him, his increasing alertness, and the way he occasionally pointed out features of the landscape, explaining their significance or sharing anecdotes from previous journeys. Late in the afternoon, with the sun beginning its descent toward the western peaks, they crested a small rise and Jedediah stopped abruptly. In the valley below, nestled against the mountainside, lay Silver Creek. Even from a distance, they could see smoke rising from chimneys, the glint of sunlight on windows, and the dark shapes of buildings partially obscured by snow. The sight affected them both profoundly. Jedediah felt a surge of triumph and relief so powerful it momentarily overwhelmed him. Catherine, who had been dozing fitfully, pushed herself up on one elbow to gaze at the town that represented salvation. "We made it," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "You kept your promise." Jedediah dismounted, moving to stand beside the travois. "We're not there yet," he cautioned, though he couldn't keep the smile from his face. "But we will be before dark." He offered her his canteen, and she drank gratefully before settling back, her energy depleted by even that small exertion. The final approach to Silver Creek proved to be among the easiest stretches of their journey. The main trail leading into town had already been partially cleared by traffic, creating a packed surface that allowed for faster progress. As they drew closer, Jedediah began to watch for familiar faces among the townspeople who moved about their business, hoping to spot Catherine's brother Michael. It was, ironically, Michael Winters who spotted them first. He had been checking the trail daily since the storm broke, hoping against hope that his sister would appear. When he saw the solitary rider approaching, pulling a travois behind his weary horse, he immediately recognized Jedediah Morgan's distinctive figure. Without hesitation, Michael sprinted toward them, shouting for the town doctor as he ran. By the time he reached them, several other men had joined him, alerted by his cries. "Catherine!" Michael called out, his face pale with fear as he knelt beside the travois. "My God, what happened?" His sister managed a weak smile, reaching out to touch his cheek. "It's a long story," she murmured, "but Jed saved my life." The next few hours passed in a blur for Jedediah. Catherine was quickly transferred to the doctor's care, carried to his office by her brother and another man, while Jedediah followed, leading his exhausted mare. The town's stablemaster took charge of the animal, promising to give her extra oats and the finest available stall. Jedediah barely registered these details, his focus entirely on Catherine as the doctor examined her, his expression grave, but not hopeless. "Pneumonia, certainly," he confirmed, "but she's past the worst of it, I think. Whatever you did out there kept her alive, Morgan. Not many would have survived such a journey in her condition." Jedediah accepted the doctor's praise with a non-committal grunt, too tired to explain the mixture of determination, desperation, and something deeper that had driven him. Michael Winters was more effusive in his gratitude, clasping Jedediah's hand in both of his own. "I can never repay you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You risked your life to save my sister." Jedediah shook his head, uncomfortable with such open sentiment. "Just doing what needed doing," he replied gruffly. "Anyone would have." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Not everyone would have undertaken such a journey, or made such promises, or felt such fear at the thought of failing. What he had done for Catherine went beyond professional obligation or common decency. The doctor insisted that Catherine remain under his care for at least a week, possibly longer. Her brother arranged for a room at the town's small hotel for Jedediah, brushing aside any mention of payment. "It's the least I can do," Michael said firmly. "Rest as long as you need." Jedediah intended to protest, to insist on moving on once he'd recovered his strength, but exhaustion claimed him before he could form the words. He slept for nearly 20 hours straight, waking disoriented in an unfamiliar room with sunlight streaming through curtained windows. For a moment, panic seized him as he tried to remember where Catherine was, if she was safe. Then memory returned, and with it, relief. Over the next few days, Jedediah regained his strength. His mare likewise recovered, though the stable master advised against demanding too much of her too soon. Jedediah visited Catherine daily, sitting beside her bed in the small room behind the doctor's office that served as an infirmary. Her recovery was slower, her body weakened by both the illness and the ordeal of their journey. But each day brought improvement, more color to her cheeks, more strength in her voice, longer periods of wakefulness. They spoke of practical matters mostly, planning for the return journey to retrieve the wagon and draft horses once spring arrived. Neither mentioned the intimacy that had developed between them during their shared ordeal, or the promises exchanged in moments of crisis. A week passed, then another. Catherine was finally well enough to be moved to her brother's home, a modest but comfortable house on the edge of town. Jedediah continued his visits, though less frequently, now that she was surrounded by her brother's family, a wife and 2 small children who had quickly embraced their aunt as one of their own. Jedediah felt increasingly out of place in this domestic setting, his weathered appearance and taciturn manner at odds with the warmth and chatter that filled the house. He began making preparations to leave Silver Creek, telling himself it was time to move on, to seek other work now that this job was complete. The evening before his planned departure, Jedediah made one final visit to say goodbye. Catherine received him in her brother's parlor, seated in an armchair near the fire. She looked almost herself again, though still thinner than when they'd started their journey. Her hair was neatly arranged, her dress clean and pressed, a far cry from the desperately ill woman he had pulled across miles of snow-covered wilderness. "Michael tells me you're leaving tomorrow," she said without preamble. Jedediah nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her eyes. "There's a supply train heading to Leadville," he explained. "They need an experienced guide." "I see," Catherine replied, her voice carefully neutral. "And after Leadville, where then?" Jedediah shrugged, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Wherever there's work, I suppose. That's how it's always been." A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, Catherine spoke again, her voice softer. "It doesn't have to be, you know." Jedediah looked up sharply, finding her eyes fixed intently on his face. "What do you mean?" he asked, though part of him already knew, had perhaps known since that night in the line shack when he'd told her about Emily, about the life he'd once hoped for. Michael owns half interest in the general store here in Silver Creek. Catherine explained. He's offered me the position of managing it. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and there's a small apartment above the store that would be mine. She paused, allowing the information to sink in. What I'm saying, Jedediah Morgan, is that I'm staying in Silver Creek, and I'm wondering if you might consider doing the same. The directness of her proposal startled him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Catherine had never been one to speak in circles or hide her intentions. Still, the implications of what she was suggesting rendered him momentarily speechless. I'm not asking for promises, Catherine continued when he didn't immediately respond. God knows we've both had enough of those to last a lifetime. I'm simply offering a possibility. She smiled slightly, a hint of vulnerability showing through her composed exterior. You carried me through the snow when I couldn't walk. You kept me alive when death seemed certain. Perhaps now we could walk forward together and see where the path leads. The simplicity and honesty of her words touched something deep within Jedediah, a place he had thought long since closed off after Emily's death. He had been alone for so long that the prospect of companionship, of sharing his life with someone again, was as terrifying as it was appealing. I'm an old man, Catherine, he said at last, voicing the first of many objections that came to mind. 53 to your 28. I've lived rough most of my life. I don't know if I can change now. Catherine's smile deepened, a spark of her old spirit lighting her eyes. I'm not asking you to change, she countered, just to consider adding something new to who you already are. She reached out, taking his weathered hand in her smaller one. You told me once that out here, people leave something for the next poor soul who might need shelter. Well, perhaps we're those souls for each other now. Jedediah looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of her skin against his calloused palm. The memory of carrying her through the snow, of promising not to leave her, rose vividly in his mind. He had meant those words when he spoke them, with every fiber of his being. What did it say about him if he walked away now, when the immediate danger had passed? I can't promise it will work, he said finally, meeting her gaze. I've been alone a long time. I might not be any good at this. He gestured vaguely between them, unable to put a name to whatever was developing. Catherine's smile remained steady, patient. Then we'll discover that together, she replied simply. All I'm asking is that you stay in Silver Creek long enough to find out. It was, Jedediah realized, a reasonable request. Not a demand for forever, just an invitation to explore possibilities. He thought of the Leadville supply train, waiting for his decision. There would be other jobs, other trails to guide. But another Catherine Winters? That seemed far less certain. All right, he agreed, his voice gruff with emotion he couldn't fully express. I'll stay, for a while at least. The joy that illuminated Catherine's face at his words made something long dormant stir in his chest, something that felt remarkably like hope. The following spring found them standing together on the porch of the general store, watching as the last patches of snow melted from the mountainsides. Catherine's hand rested comfortably in the crook of Jedediah's arm, a familiar gesture that had developed naturally over the months since their ordeal. The store was prospering under their joint management, her business acumen complemented by his practical knowledge of what miners, trappers, and settlers truly needed to survive in this unforgiving land. They had retrieved the wagon and draft horses once the passes cleared, finding the animals healthy and the cabin much as they had left it. The journey had been easier in spring conditions, with no blizzards to contend with and no illness to fear. We should leave something, Catherine had suggested as they prepared to depart the cabin that had sheltered them during the worst of the storm. Jedediah understood immediately. He had already replenished the firewood stack and left dried beans and salt pork in the cupboard, following the trapper's code. Now, he added a small tin of coffee and a packet of sugar, luxuries that might make all the difference to some future traveler caught in similar straits. Catherine placed a carefully folded quilt on the bunk, one she had made herself during the winter evenings in Silver Creek. "For the next, poor soul," she said softly, echoing Jedediah's words from months before. He nodded in approval, understanding the gesture's significance. Now, as they stood, watching spring reclaim the mountains, Jedediah reflected on how much had changed in the space of a single season. He had stayed in Silver Creek, initially telling himself it was temporary, just until Catherine was fully recovered, just until spring came, just until he got restless again. But the restlessness hadn't come. Instead, he had found himself settling into a life he'd never imagined possible. A life that included not just work and survival, but companionship, purpose, and increasingly, love. It wasn't always easy. They were both strong-willed, accustomed to independence, and carried their own scars from the past. But they were learning, day by day, how to walk the path together. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about what you said that night in the snow." Jedediah raised an eyebrow questioningly. Many things had been said during those desperate days, not all of which he cared to remember. "When I asked you not to leave me," Catherine clarified, turning to face him fully, "you said you'd carry me until your last breath." There was something in her expression that Jedediah couldn't quite read, a mixture of solemnity and hope that made his heart quicken. "I did," he acknowledged, "and I meant it." Catherine nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "I believe you did," she said softly, "just as I believe you meant it when you stayed in Silver Creek, even though every instinct told you to move on." She took both his hands in hers, her green eyes steady on his face. "I'm wondering if you might consider making that promise more permanent." For the second time since meeting Catherine Winters, Jedediah found himself momentarily speechless. He had thought about marriage, of course, had even begun to hope it might be possible someday. But he hadn't expected her to be the one to broach the subject, or for it to happen now, while they were still learning each other's ways. Yet as he looked at her upturned face, he realized the timing didn't matter. Some things once known couldn't be unknown. "I'm still an old man," he said, echoing his objection from months before. Catherine's lips curved into a smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "And I'm still not asking you to change," she replied, "just to continue being exactly who you are, the man who carried me through the snow when all seemed lost." Jedediah felt a smile of his own forming in response. There were practical considerations, logistical details to discuss, but none of that seemed important in this moment. What mattered was the simple truth that had been forged during their journey through the blizzard, and had only strengthened in the months since. They were better together than apart. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll make it permanent." Catherine's smile broadened into a grin of pure joy, and she rose on tiptoe to press her lips to his, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent, but no less thrilling for its familiarity. When they parted, Jedediah kept his arms around her, marveling at how naturally she fit against him. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when you hired me back in Denver, I never imagined it would lead to this." Catherine laughed, the sound as bright and clear as the spring air around them. Neither did I, she admitted, but I'm very glad it did. They stood together a while longer, watching as the sun cast long shadows across the awakening land, the promise of new beginnings written in every budding leaf and melting snowdrift. In the years that followed, the story of their journey through the blizzard became something of a legend in Silver Creek. How Jedediah Morgan had carried Catherine Winters for miles through deadly conditions, refusing to leave her despite the dangers. Some embellished the tale, adding encounters with wolves or mountain lions, or claiming the temperature had dropped to impossible lows. Jedediah and Catherine never corrected these exaggerations. The truth, they knew, was remarkable enough that two people, thrown together by circumstance, had found in each other the strength to survive, not just a physical ordeal, but the deeper challenge of opening their hearts again after loss and disappointment. And if Jedediah occasionally woke in the night, reaching instinctively to make sure Catherine was still beside him, safe and breathing easily, she never mentioned it. She simply took his hand and held it until they both drifted back to sleep, secure in the knowledge that neither would ever face the snow alone again. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.